Welcome to Eye to Market, a web series designed to help you explore and navigate the successful path to market for your ophthalmic innovation. Welcome to Eye to Market. My name is Brian and I'll be your host today. In this episode, we're going to talk about clinical trials. How do we plan for success? What can we do to de-risk the process? Let's get started.
If I could back up a little bit and
Please.
tell you a little about where we come from at Johnson & Johnson. So currently we serve about 40 million patients across the world. And we have a lot of work to do because there's about 2 billion patients that could benefit from sight-enhancing technologies and innovations that we develop. And so when we think about clinical trials, we're really coming from putting the patient at the center of everything that we do. So what does that mean in practically speaking? When we think about our clinical strategy, we are laser focused on ensuring that we are targeting value-based outcomes. And value-based outcomes means primarily, what is this going to mean for the patient at the point of care? From there, of course, we have to expand because we have many people to serve and those clinical trials have many jobs to deliver. So then we think about, okay, how are we going to ensure that these outcomes are compatible with what an investor is looking at, compatible with what a regulator would need, what do the payers need to see? All of those are downstream decisions. But primarily, what really drives us is how are we going to move the needle for the patient at the point of care, value-based outcomes.
One of the things that our innovators might want to understand is how would J&J go about designing, say, a proof of concept study to be as lean and efficient, but with the proper outcomes that you need in order to justify taking that next step so that you maximize the use of those resources?
We have a saying at J&J, which is not unique to J&J, but you have to slow down to speed up, and proof of concept studies are a great story around slowing down to speed up. So just a moment of passion, proof of concept studies are some of the most exciting clinical trials that you can possibly do because you've got these amazing subject matter experts and scientists that have identified a need at the moment of discovery, and you just literally see people light up and they just want to get the job done. They're so excited. Your point is an excellent one, which is how do we ensure that the outcomes that we obtain from those proof of concept studies are going to do the job that we really need to do so that proof of concept study does not hold us back from getting the innovation to where we want it to be, which is, again, with the patient. So we slow down, we go deep. That is where we work deeply with our internal subject matter experts. We bring in external subject matter experts. We go all the way down to ensure that the thing that we are looking to show at the end of that trial will resonate in such a way that we are able to make the go, no-go decision that the proof of concept study is all about.
What are some of the common pitfalls that our innovators may face in designing a clinical trial that your experience can help them avoid?
I would say one of the key and most upsetting errors that I've observed along my journey are when the scientists change their plan based on perceived agitation or influence from a stakeholder that is not an expert in clinical trial design.
Okay.
And so it's very important to listen to the input. It's so critical to listen to the input and ask yourself and challenge yourself, does the outcome that I'm going after or outcomes that I'm going after address the needs that the stakeholder is looking for or asking for? And if the answer is no, you have work to do. If the answer is yes, just ensure that you don't break down or rework or change course in such a way that will leave you at the end. Another one is pressure to go too fast, to expedite the execution of the clinical trial, and skipping steps. They keep telling you, especially at early stage, they tell you they know what they're doing. you need to know for yourself that they know what they're doing. So monitoring that study along the journey is absolutely crucial. And we could talk about some other steps. So don't skip steps, no matter what the pressure is. You can be operationally efficient in so many ways without skipping steps. And then the third one is you really you need to trust. If you've done all that right, you really need to trust the data. So in my experience, in the early stage, you have a lot of passion around ideas and perceived known outcomes. I know this product is going to do X. Mm-hmm. I'm sure of it. Mm-hmm. And then the data comes back and it doesn't look quite the way perhaps scientists or the clinicians or the business team had expected. And so sometimes there can be a tendency to doubt the data. Well, the trial wasn't run right. And that might be true, but if you've not skipped steps and you've followed all the rules, you know in your zone of expertise that you did it right, then you need to trust the data.
What are some of the key things that you think about setting up a clinical trial for success?
Your plan. This starts very early when you first are going into humans. I mean, hopefully, but de-risking the whole project starts early and showing proof of concept and different animal models, doing PK work to see that your doses when you go to humans are in the right range, and then trying to plan that trial, the phase 1 trial right. Your phase 1 trials are typically felt to be safety studies, but if you're creative and you want to get future funding, you try to show proof of concept in that very early trial. And there are ways of being a little creative to do that. And, sometimes it might be looking at the fellow eye in addition to the treated eye, or having a natural history in the eye of treatment first. And so you I get an idea of progression rate of, say, GA, and then doing the run-in, do the treatment. And not only do you see safety, but you hopefully see a little signal, because it's really good to try to get proof of concept as soon as you can, because every step costs more money in injections in particular. But trial design is very important beyond just the safety. You also need to try to find endpoints that are approved by regulators. So it's not all just about the animal studies. Once you go to human trials, when you do that phase 1 study, there are other ways to de-risk it. For instance, most phase 1 studies are felt to be safety studies, but you want to try to get a proof of concept, of proof of action of your agent if at all possible. And sometimes you have to be creative to do that. But in things like geographic atrophy that are really hard to show that, you may look at the fellow eye that's not injected and compare the two, or have a 6 months before you do the injection of the phase 1, get a rate of progression beforehand, and then you do the phase 1 study after that and compare to see if you can eke out a signal from these small numbers that are often in phase 1 trials. That's a way of sort of de-risking for the next stage if you get that signal. It doesn't mean you have to quit if you don't get a signal. But with small numbers and the variability we have, especially in retina, but in everything, it's challenging sometimes to really confirm a treatment effect if you don't have a whopping difference, which is not always the case in certain diseases. And then when you design the trial, you want to execute it. You want to have people that know what they're doing. You don't want to go to sites that are just learning how to be a study site, because every drop patient or protocol deviation is sort of a difficult thing to deal with. And so you want to have reliable people. You want to have a good CRO to help you with it. And hopefully what you're offering the patients is an advantage over the standard of care, and so you get good enrollment, because you don't want a trial that's structured so difficult to enroll that years go by and you're still enrolling and you get lost at sea while the world moves on around you.
You mentioned to us that it was critical to find a good partner, right? So if you could, for a moment or two, expound on what that kind of means to you. What does that right partner look like? What's the advice that partner is going to bring to the table that's going to be useful to our innovators?
Sure. You want a partner that has experience, right? Someone that's done this before. And when we think about designing that first clinical trial to achieve data that's going to help fuel the investment and inform your plan for development in totality, you want to make sure that it's designed where it's robust enough to answer those questions. I understand that there's limitations on budgets often early on for sure, but we want to make sure that we're not cutting it too small to then not give us the right answer. We want to make sure that we're looking at endpoints that are going to be meaningful. And this whole idea of, yes, you can have a statistically significant finding, but is it clinically meaningful?
Right.
And is it going to achieve regulatory approval in the United States, but maybe for some OUS regions? So how do you harmonize that development plan or that clinical trial? And then, as we've discussed, the commercial success is so critical. So are you asking certain PROs that focus on quality of life for that particular indication? Are there sort of patient advocate groups that you can speak to see what's most important to them, and then you incorporate that into your clinical trial for questions. So you want to pack as much as you can into that trial, work with a partner that has a lot of experience, that has stepped in those potholes and tripped on whatever,
Right.
and then you can take that knowledge and just really set it up for success. Because at the end of the day, once you have that data, you'll be shopping that data around to additional investors, to strategics, and you want to be able to answer the questions that you're going to get about that clinical trial and the opportunity.
How important is it to get that first in-human use clinical trial as you're reaching out to investors and soliciting their support? How much more successful do you think our innovators can be when they have that versus only having their preclinical tox study type data?
Great question, and the answer is it's essential to have first-in-human data. If you think about what investors are interested in strategics, is they want to de-risk a program moving forward, right? It may be the most exciting molecule, the best indication to go after, but they need to de-risk the program. So you do that by getting into the target patient population and understanding, first, does the drug work? And then second, how does it work and which endpoints, right? It's also very important to get data to show how your product's differentiated, right? So, it's rare to be in a field that's a totally white space, right? It's not terribly common. Often you're going after a vetted indication or space, but you have to show why is your product different, right? Right. So you can now get that clinical data to show the differentiation, which is really important. And also give a little bit of insight into the commercial success, right? So what is this product going to do commercially, and that clinical meaningfulness? And we can theorize about that all we want with preclinical data only, but you have to have that information to be successful. We've even seen that investors in today's landscape are waiting. They'd rather wait till late stage on a program. It may cost more to acquire something or a bigger investment, but it's more certain.
Yeah.
Right. So first in human data is critical, and as much of it as you can get is only going to help you.
De-risking means different things in different spaces within ophthalmology. However, if you're dealing with sort of a high risk need, meaning you can't spend too much money, you can't do too long a trial, you want to see something in a smaller number of patients faster, in those particular scenarios, the opportunity, I think, is really to work with the key stakeholders within the entire ophthalmology ecosystem. So work with the KOLs, get guidance from the regulators, and try to figure out, based on the endpoints that are available, what approach makes the most sense. And I do think, de-risking for a company that plans to actually sell off the asset can come in many forms. You can do a cheap study in a part of the world that, maybe isn't going to resonate as well with potential buyers, or you could do something that's smaller, going to cost a little more, includes a couple of key KOLs in the United States, and you've sort of de-risked what you're trying to do, even though there's a little bit of a cost add with trying to take that approach. Operational risk is really huge. And that's something that we, as a service company, really have to work closely with our sponsor partners on, because everybody at the sponsor organization has a plan for what they want to get out of the trial. And there is a phenomenon which we call, trying to find the perfect patient, which has a negative impact on your operational execution ability. If you are getting so narrow and tweaking your inclusion-exclusion criteria based on the input from every KOL you talk to really try to find that patient that's going to be a perfect responder, you are not going to compete well with the other 10 studies going on in geographic atrophy at your clinical trial sites. You're not going to make the burden minimized for the patient that's participating, because you're doing multiple assessments. You're doing more than the industry standard. So I think balancing the study risk, which there's ways that can be done, with the operational risk of failing to enroll well, having to do multiple amendments, failing to complete the study on time, and running low on money if you're a biotech company.
You talk about the operational risk, and I think about the importance of selecting the right sites.
Yep.
They're going to actually execute what you need done the way you need it done, and that you have a high level of trust in.
Typically, how we think about it is we look for, one, where are the patients available? We look for, two, what's the experience of that site, the quality of that particular site. And sometimes, it's caused us to shift and do things global earlier on in the process. We see that a fair amount. Historically, when it was less competitive, you'd do the majority of your development program in the U.S., and then you'd maybe go global for one of your phase 3 trials if you had the need. Now we're seeing, the phase 2As go global. And, if you're seeking a treatment-naive patient, you may need to go somewhere else in the world to find a treatment-naive patient more easily.
One of the trends that we've seen in the retinal market is a trend towards more specialized gene therapies, more patient-specific, adaptive therapies. And as a result of that, one of the things that we're seeing is there's a greater tendency for operational challenges in structuring a clinical trial in that space. So what are some of the steps that our audience could use to help navigate that and mitigate the risk when you're dealing with such a niche part of the market?
Yeah, there are two areas where we see with rare inherited retinal diseases, companies that really sort of push the envelope tend to be successful. Develop relationships with the key optogeneticists that are out there. There's not a huge number of them. There's about 30 to 40 of them that really do almost all of the work in the space. Meet with them, get a sense for their interest in the product, get a sense for their patient populations. And then on the CRO side, what we do a lot of is encouraging natural history study work, or at least pre-screening protocols ahead of the main protocol, because the screen fail rates are high. If you're dealing with a patient that has to have a certain genetic criteria, maybe you've got some of that sorted out. A lot of the patients are at this point genotyped at these centers, but then you have to throw an additional imaging requirement on top of it, something that the reading center is going to have to verify that the patient possesses. It's much easier to operate a study if you have those two big boxes that create screen failure checked off beforehand. And on top of that, the clinical trial visits for inherited retinal disease are incredibly labor intensive, 2-3 days sometimes of various assessments that the patient has to go through. And it's a tough process on the patient because the patient is blind. They're going through and doing a huge number of exams at the clinician's office. If you can in some way, risk mitigate the fact that patient does 3 days of tests and then a reading center decides that they aren't qualified after the fact.
We've talked about the importance of having ophthalmic experts helping to design and analyze our clinical trials during the early phases 1 and 2, and the criticality of knowing what we're looking at within the data. How does that compare or contrast to phase 3? Is it even more important to have those individuals and that expertise in analyzing and planning for your data structure in phase 3, or is it less important?
When you get to phase 3, you're doing everything at mass scale, and that includes startup activities related to ophthalmology assessments, BCBA lane certification, working with the imaging center and doing all the certifications associated with the imaging center. A lot of ophthalmic expertise is really, valuable to being efficient with that phase 3 process also as you really scale up. And certainly the adverse event management component, the safety, you want a person involved in that process who understands ophthalmology and is not just sort of a general MD from another space. So I think, it certainly is critical across all phases, and even perhaps in a way more critical with phase 3, because whatever happens in phase 3, that's going towards your label, so you want to make sure you manage it carefully.